In September 2023, FBI Special Agent Joshua Pullen was alerted to an incident involving Reagan Gray, a 26-year-old volunteer at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, and one of the teenage members of a youth group she oversaw. The victim's parents discovered the inappropriate relationship in 2020 when they found text messages between their son and Gray in the young man's phone. They told Gray to stop interacting with their son and reported the misconduct to lead pastor Stephen Smith. Gray reportedly told Smith that her relationship with the teen wasn't physical. She was removed from the volunteer program but was allowed to return after she underwent counseling, and nobody contacted the police. In early 2024, Smith allegedly revealed that Gray had admitted that the relationship was physical and that it continued even after the victim's parents told her to back off. The victim confirmed that this was true during an interview with FBI agents and provided additional details about the extent of his communications with Gray. Based on the victim's claims, there were somewhere between 5 and 10 inappropriate encounters between him and Gray over a several-month-long period. After learning about the ongoing investigation, Gray's superiors put her on leave. She's currently facing an assault charge and is free on a $20,000 bond while awaiting the outcome of her case. Number 18. Coley McCraney. Teenagers Tracy Hawlett and J.B. Beasley vanished in July of 1999 after going out to celebrate Beasley's birthday together. They got lost while trying to drive to a party in Headlands, Alabama, and decided to head back to Hawlett's house. The young women stopped at a gas station in rural Ozark, where they asked for directions and called Hawlett's mother. It was the last anyone ever heard from the girls. The next morning, police spotted Beasley's seemingly abandoned black Mazda along a roadside near the gas station. Inside the truck, they found the teenagers' murdered bodies. Beasley and Hawlett had both been shot in the head for nearly 2 decades. The killer's identity remained a mystery as investigators hit one dead end after another. With no witnesses and no murder weapon, detectives had relatively little to go on in their efforts to solve the double murder. In 2018, Ozark Police Chief Marlos Walker learned about a groundbreaking investigative technique called genetic genealogy, which is used to identify DNA profiles through a person's relatives. He sent DNA evidence from the crime to a lab in Virginia and waited for the results. 5 months later, Walker received a list of possible matches to DNA found on Beasley's body. He recognized the name of a high school classmate, a married preacher named Coley McCraney, and asked him for a DNA sample. McCraney provided the sample willingly, and Walker was shocked to learn that it was a perfect match to the crime scene DNA. Until that point, McCraney had never been a suspect or even a person of interest in the investigation, and he denied having any involvement in the horrific crime. But as the saying goes, DNA doesn't lie. And in 2019, McCraney was charged with the murders of Tracy Hawlett and J.B. Beasley. McCraney then changed his story, claiming that he and Beasley had a consensual encounter and that he didn't realize she was a murder victim until after his arrest. But the jury was unswayed by the claim, and in 2023, McCraney was found guilty of capital murder. He continues to maintain his innocence from behind bars while serving a life sentence without parole. Number 17. Chaiwat Melachate. In May of 2012, a Buddhist monk was accused of killing the head monk at the Wat Buddharaka Temple in Grand Bay, Alabama. 32-year-old Vern Fadsami allegedly bludgeoned 45-year-old Chaiwat Melachate to death during an argument. According to prosecutors, Fadsame struck Melachate in the head at least a dozen times with a wooden pestle. He then carried on with his day like normal, returned to his living quarters where he showered, washed his clothes, and then ate. At the time of the murder, Melachate had been the monastery's head monk for a dozen years. He had led an effort to rebuild the temple in recent years after it was destroyed in a fire. Fadsami had immigrated to the U.S. from Laos several years earlier. Prosecutors claimed that the deadly disagreement between Melachate and Fadsami was over food. In the 3 months leading up to the murder, Futsami had stopped speaking entirely. He holed up in his room and refused to join the other monks for meals. Molachate tried to help him, but he wasn't receptive to the assistance. When Futsami refused to take medication or accept any other form of help, Molachate began making arrangements to send him away from the monastery for treatment. In June of 2013, Futsami pleaded guilty to a reduced manslaughter charge in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. Number 16. Tomasz Smazali. In August of 2023, a Polish priest named Tomasz Smazali threw a wild, adult, men-only party at his apartment in the city of Dąbrowa Górnicza. During the gathering, a male escort overdosed on performance-enhancing pills and collapsed on the floor. When the man's friend wanted to call for help, Smazali allegedly kicked the friend out of the party. He called emergency services after leaving the gathering with his ailing friend still inside. Smazali refused to let paramedics inside the apartment when they showed up, prompting someone to call the police. Officers forced their way into the residence where the man who had overdosed was found lying helplessly with the lower part of his body mutilated. As word of the incident spread, Smazali was stripped of his church duties. A few months later, he was arrested on various drug-related charges and other crimes, including failing to provide assistance to a person in danger of loss of life or serious bodily harm. He denied throwing an adult male party and accused the press of only focusing on him due to his profession. Smazali was found guilty in 2024 following a trial that took place behind closed doors. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay the victim more than $3,800 in restitution. The disgraced former clergyman was also ordered to start a fund to help crime victims. Number 15. Matthew Lee Richards. In September of 2023, 911 dispatchers in Johnson County, Kansas received an influx of emergency calls about a house that was on fire. They also received a call from a member of that household about the homeowner chasing them with a knife. Officers arrived at the scene to find a mother and her 2 kids waiting outside the house with stab wounds. They were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. 3 other household members with life-threatening injuries were also taken to the hospital. Thankfully, all of the victims survived. They identified the head of the household, 41-year-old Matthew Lee Richards, as the perpetrator. He exited the burning house at the command of police and allegedly admitted to stabbing his wife and kids. Richards, who was a children's pastor at a local church, said he had been dishonest toward his wife about their financial situation. The family was also apparently unaware that they were about to be evicted from their home that very day. A fellow pastor, Kurt Witten, told local station KMBC that he would have helped if he knew Richards was struggling. But instead of being honest and reaching out for the assistance his family needed, Richards allegedly tried to kill them, and he is now facing 5 counts of attempted murder and an aggravated arson charge. Records show that he remains held on $5 million bail at the Johnson County Jail while awaiting trial. Number 14. Sarah McDermott and Eileen Igoe. In recent years, decades-old allegations of abuse were brought against a pair of Scottish Catholic nuns who are now in their 80s. Between 1969 and 1981, sisters Sarah McDermott and Eileen Igoe allegedly committed cruel and unnatural acts against vulnerable individuals who were in the care of the Order of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul in Lanark. A caretaker in her late 70s, Margaret Hughes, was also accused of inflicting cruel abuse on the victims. When the trio went to trial in early 2024, former residents testified that they had suffered and witnessed beatings, verbal abuse, force feedings, freezing cold baths, having their head held underwater, and even being forced to eat their own vomit. The defendants' attorneys essentially argued that the accused abusers were living in different times and that they didn't fully understand the impacts that their treatment would have on the victims. Moreover, the defense argued the nuns had done a lot of good in many people's lives and were remembered fondly by many of the individuals they once cared for. The case against McDermott, Igoe, and Hughes came at a time when allegations of abuse at the facility had only recently started to pour out of the woodwork. And as more victims come forward, the narrative of a loving and peaceful environment is being called further and further into question. Consequently, the judge overseeing the case concluded that there was no reasonable alternative to prison. He sentenced each of the women to 3 years behind bars, which at their age means that they could very well end up spending the rest of their lives in prison. Number 13. Lamar Miller Whitehead, known for his flashy style and his friendship with New York City Mayor Eric Adams, Bishop Lamar Miller Whitehead was a prime target for the thieves who robbed him during a sermon in 2022 at the Leaders of Tomorrow International Churches in Brooklyn's Canarsie neighborhood. The robbers made off with $1 million worth of the preacher and his wife's jewelry. Miller Whitehead made news headlines again a few months later when he was indicted on federal fraud and extortion charges. He was accused of squandering $90,000 of a parishioner's retirement money on himself after persuading the victim to invest her funds with him. The crooked bishop also allegedly promised government favors that he knew he couldn't deliver as part of his efforts to convince another victim to loan him $500,000. As it turned out, Miller Whitehead was no stranger to financial crimes. 14 years earlier, in 2008, he had been convicted of 17 counts of fraud. When his more recent case went to trial in March of 2024, Miller was convicted of wire fraud, lying to the FBI, and attempted extortion. He's currently awaiting sentencing and has announced through his lawyers that he plans to appeal his case. Number 12. Chad and Melanie Temple. Over a 3-year period lasting from 2019 to 2022, 40-year-old Melanie Ann Temple and her husband, 38-year-old Chad Lamar Temple, allegedly embezzled a 6-figure sum of money from Belmont Baptist Church in Calhoun, Georgia. As an employee of the church, Melanie had access to their credit cards. Her superiors only noticed the theft after the church underwent a forensic audit, which revealed troubling inconsistencies in the parish's finances. The church contacted law enforcement and an investigation was launched. A year and a half later, in early 2024, Melanie and Chad were arrested in suspicion of racking up a $212,000 tab on the church's dime and without the parish's knowledge or consent. According to Calhoun Police Chief Tony Pyle, the couple started out by making small, infrequent charges. The more they got away with, the bigger the amount and frequency of the fraudulent charges grew. Chad and Melanie are accused of buying a large amount of pet products for their dog breeding business, as well as personal items. They are each facing over 300 felony charges, including 1 count for each fraudulent credit card purchase. Melanie was charged with 198 counts of financial transaction card fraud, 138 counts of criminal receipt of goods or services fraudulently obtained, 60 counts of criminal receipt of goods, and 1 count each of financial transaction card theft and theft by deception. Chad stands accused of 198 counts of criminal receipt of goods or services fraudulently obtained, 198 counts of financial transaction card fraud, theft by deception, financial transaction card theft, and a probation violation in connection with a prior charge of selling methamphetamine. According to the most recent available updates on the case, Melanie Temple had posted bond, while Chad Temple remained in custody at the Gordon County Jail. Number 11. Samuel Pacias. In March of 2024, a preacher from Riverside County, California, was accused of hiring a hitman to murder his daughter's boyfriend. According to prosecutors, 47-year-old Samuel Pacias paid several men nearly $40,000 total to fatally shoot the intended victim. The hired assassins allegedly spent several weeks conducting surveillance on the target. On the planned date of the murder, hitmen drove up next to the victim and shot him in his car. The victim drove himself to the hospital where he was treated for multiple gunshot wounds. He survived the botched murder-for-hire plot, and investigators soon uncovered evidence that Pacias was behind the crime. According to police, the murderous priest provided the hitmen with information about the victim, including his whereabouts on the night of the planned shooting. Pacias faces charges of solicitation for murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. He remains held on $1 million bail as he awaits trial. 55-year-old Juan Manuel Ceballos is also facing charges in connection with the crime, including conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. He also remains in custody on $1 million bail. Number 10. David Sandstra. Back in August of 1975, a young girl named Gretchen Harrington disappeared on her way to a Bible study in Marple Township, Pennsylvania. Her skeletal remains were found 2 months later in Ridley Creek State Park. During the investigation into Harrington's murder, detectives spoke with her pastor, David Sandstra, but they lacked enough evidence to say for certain whether they believed Sandstra had killed Harrington, and the case went cold. It stayed that way until more than 45 years later, when a surviving victim of the preacher came forward with shocking allegations of abuse. The woman had even written in her diary during the same year as Harrington's murder that she believed Sandstra was responsible for at least 2 attempted kidnappings. In July of 2023, investigators confronted Sandstra with their newfound evidence of the crime. The 83-year-old reportedly admitted to killing Harrington, finally bringing answers to the decades-old unsolved murder. Sandstra gave police a detailed confession of exactly what happened that day when he spotted Harrington walking down the street and made his sinister move. State Trooper Eugene Trey told reporters that there was a noticeable difference in Sandstra's demeanor after he told the truth. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, even though he knew he was going to most likely end up in prison for his actions. Not surprisingly, however, his defense attorney is now claiming that his confession was coerced. Following his arrest, Sandstra was extradited from his home in Marietta, Georgia, to Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He remains held without bail while awaiting trial. Number 9. Ronnie Leon Hyde. In 1994, a Florida teenager named Fred Laster vanished in Yulee. His whereabouts and fate remained a mystery until 2016, when a dismembered torso that had been found nearly 20 years earlier was identified as Laster. The connection was made thanks to an anonymous tip which prompted investigators to run a DNA test on the unidentified remains. Following the identification of Laster's partial remains, investigators zeroed in on former youth pastor Ronnie Leon Hyde, who was suspected of abusing Laster and at least one other victim around the time of Laster's disappearance. Hyde was the last person to see Laster alive. He claimed that Laster had called him up late at night and asked for a ride. Laster had supposedly gotten into an argument with his sister and was upset. According to Hyde, the teen mentioned wanting to run away to be with relatives in Illinois. At some point during the drive, Laster allegedly bolted from Hyde's car and was never seen again. Detectives always found his story suspicious, and their suspicions only grew after they found evidence corroborating the abuse allegations. Hyde was charged with Laster's murder in early 2017, following an FBI raid on his home in Jacksonville. He was also charged with other crimes based on disturbing material that was found at the residence. Laster's torso was found with the dismembered body parts of another victim who remains unidentified to this day, leading authorities to suspect that Hyde may have committed more than one murder. Around the time of his arrest, the FBI posted billboards seeking additional information about Hyde, but the identity of the second victim remains a mystery. Despite the mounting evidence pointing toward his guilt in Laster's death and possibility that he may have killed more than one person, Hyde maintained his innocence. Throughout the duration of his trial, he repeatedly claimed he would have never harmed Laster and maintained a relaxed and friendly demeanor, but it failed to convince the jury of his innocence. In 2017, he was convicted of Laster's murder. He's currently serving life without parole in the Florida state prison system. Number 8. Rashid Ali Bynum. 30-year-old New Jersey councilwoman Eunice K. Dwumfor was Sayreville's first African-American elected official. Her first term was tragically cut short in February 2022 when she was gunned down in cold blood one evening for what seemed like no apparent reason. Dwumfor was in her car outside her apartment building and had just returned home from shopping when she was struck by the gunfire. She lost control of the vehicle, which rolled down the inclined street and crashed into a pair of parked cars. During her short-lived political career, Dwumfor quickly earned a reputation for being a competent, responsible and dedicated pillar of her community. Her murder was both shocking and devastating to the people in her life, who will never get to see how far she would have gone with her budding career. And while anyone who works in politics is at risk of making enemies, nobody could fathom why someone might want Dwumfor dead. Based on the timing and location of the shooting, investigators believe that Dwumfor was specifically targeted. Months passed without any arrest, causing her friends, loved ones and colleagues to start wondering if justice would ever be served. Finally, in late May of 2023, more than a year after Dwumfor's death, authorities charged a 28-year-old Virginia man named Rashid Ali Bynum with her murder. The two reportedly knew each other through a church Bible study Dwumfor had founded called Fire Congress Fellowship. She and Bynum grew close and even lived together, but at some point, Bynum's relationship with the group soured. He moved out of Dwumfor's New Jersey home and returned to Virginia. The specific circumstances leading up to the shooting have yet to be revealed. In the meantime, Bynum maintains his innocence from behind bars while awaiting trial. Number 7. Nason Joaquin Garcia. Career Minister Nason Joaquin Garcia succeeded his father as the international director of the Mexico-based La Luz del Mundo megachurch in 2014 at age 45. 5 years later, in June of 2019, he was arrested in Los Angeles, California, on suspicion of abusing multiple victims. Joaquin Garcia was accused of conspiring with a woman named Susana Medina Oaxaca and another accomplice named Alondra Ocampo. All three suspects were held on bail, amounts ranging from $25 to $50 million while awaiting trial. In the meantime, Joaquin Garcia was sued in civil court for allegedly harming another victim. His father was also named as a defendant in the lawsuit. 2 days before he was scheduled to go to trial, the disgraced pastor pleaded guilty to 3 abuse-related charges. He was sentenced to more than 16 and a half years in state prison. After serving his time, he'll be required to register as a predator for the rest of his life. Susana Medina Oaxaca pleaded guilty to assault, likely to cause great bodily injury. She was sentenced to a year of probation and ordered to undergo psychiatric counseling. Alondra Ocampo was sentenced to 4 years in prison for allegedly helping Joaquin Garcia commit his crimes. Number 6. Olivia Lee Weatherly. In March of 2017, 33-year-old Olivia Lee Weatherly was arrested on suspicion of having an inappropriate relationship with a teenager while working as a volunteer at the Pebble Creek Baptist Church in Greenville County, South Carolina. She was accused of engaging in multiple illegal acts with the victim over the course of a year, including one incident which occurred in the backseat of a car. Local authorities launched an investigation into Weatherly's alleged misconduct after receiving a tip in late 2016. Based on their findings, they charged her with several counts of criminal conduct. Weatherly was released from jail on a $40,000 bond, but updates on the case have not been forthcoming. Number 5. Natalie Sorrells. In February of 2024, 44-year-old real estate agent Natalie Sorrells was accused of having an inappropriate relationship with a victim she met while volunteering at Lake Point Church in Heath, Texas. According to an affidavit, authorities learned about the alleged misconduct after the victim's mother discovered incriminating text messages in his phone. Based on the nature of their conversations, it seemed clear that some major lines had been crossed. During an interview with investigators, the victim reportedly described multiple instances of illegal contact with the much older real estate agent. According to the teen, one of these meetings was interrupted by a phone call from Sorrells' husband, who called to ask her if she was cheating on him. In addition to the inappropriate relationship, Sorrells allegedly served alcohol and tobacco to the victim and his friends on multiple occasions. She faces 4 charges, including 2 counts of indecency and 2 assault counts. Following Sorrells' arrest, Lake Point Church released a statement denying that any inappropriate contact occurred on church property and reassuring the public that Sorrells had been let go from her volunteer position. The outcome of her case remains to be seen. Number 4. Michael Green. In February 2024, the Episcopal Diocese of Albany, New York, was faced with an unusual situation. A local priest, 49-year-old Father Michael Green of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, allegedly had a relationship with a former church employee and slashed that person's car tires. According to a police report, the crime occurred in broad daylight inside a parking garage using an unknown cutting instrument. Green was charged with 1 count of criminal mischief. The unnamed victim told the Albany Times-Union that she and Green began a consensual relationship shortly after she started working at the church as a part-time bookkeeper and travel planner. During the summer of 2023, just weeks later, the woman quit her job because she felt uncomfortable being in a relationship with Green and working with him. The couple continued seeing each other until shortly before Christmas, when Green allegedly became aggressive toward the woman while she was driving. After that, the victim decided to stay in the hotel room alone. A few weeks later, Green was accused of slashing her tires. Speaking with the Times-Union, Green described the allegation as a misunderstanding that he hoped would be resolved soon. At the time, the diocese was considering repercussions against the priest, noting that they were unaware of the situation before being contacted by the news outlet. Green was absent from church services during the week of his arrest, but he remains listed on the church's website as an active leader of the congregation. The status of his criminal case is unclear. Number 3. John Fyatt. 25-year-old Irene Garza was a school teacher, a former beauty queen, and a devout Catholic. She was last seen alive in McAllen, Texas in 1960 while on her way to confession. 5 days later, the beloved educator's lifeless body was found dumped in a local canal. Garza had been brutally assaulted, suffocated with a plastic bag, and discarded by a cold-blooded killer who managed to fly under the radar for more than a half-century. An arrest was finally made in 2016 when the church's former priest, John Fyatt, was charged with Garza's murder. The decision to move forward with the case came after new evidence was presented to a grand jury. In addition to the discovery of new evidence, 2 fellow priests finally came forward and admitted to knowing that Fyatt had murdered Garza. Now frail and in his 80s, Fyatt hardly looked like a heartless killer as he slowly entered the courtroom using a walker. He had been a person of interest early on in the case, and he insisted all along that the authorities were targeting the wrong man. But investigators were 100% certain that they had finally nailed Garza's killer after years of frustration over having to let him walk free due to a lack of evidence, especially when keeping in mind that Fyatt would have been physically capable of committing the horrific crime nearly 60 years earlier at the age of 27. The case had gone cold relatively early on in the investigation and had been reopened in 2004. It took another 12 years before Fyatt was finally arrested, and by that point everyone involved in the case was more than ready to bring him to justice. During Fyatt's trial, prosecutors revealed that he had a less than impeccable behavioral record throughout his career. Shortly after Garza's murder, he had been sent to a reformatory for troubled priests. Despite this, he managed to move up through the ranks and spent much of his working years in a supervisory position. Fyatt was found guilty of Garza's murder and sentenced to life in prison. He served about 4 years before he was found dead in his cell from cardiac arrest in 2020 at the age of 86. Today's topic was requested by Donye Levini, Sisters for I Am Maccabeefu, and Worldview 730. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Aubrey Lee Price. Aubrey Lee Price became a pastor after graduating from a Baptist college in Mount Vernon, Georgia in 1990, but it didn't pay the kind of money that a married father needed to make in order to comfortably support his family. So in 2000, Price made a career change and became an investment advisor while still preaching part-time. He remained a devout Christian, or so it seemed. Price developed a multi-million-dollar investment firm, but he squandered dozens of his clients' life savings by creating a Ponzi scheme. He also defrauded a federally insured bank that was already suffering from the effects of the 2008 global recession. In 2012, Price realized that collapse was imminent. Instead of facing the consequences of his poor decisions head-on, he vanished in an attempt to fake his own death. Before disappearing, he wrote farewell letters to friends and family admitting that he had defrauded his investors. Based on the information in the letters, the Coast Guard searched for Price's body off Florida's Gulf Coast. They never found him, but a judge granted his family's request to have him declared legally dead a few months later. Despite this, some people didn't believe Price was really dead, including FBI agents who were investigating his fraud, and they were right. Price was living on the lam, and he managed to evade the authorities for more than a year before he was pulled over in Brunswick, Georgia, on New Year's Eve in 2013. He gave the officer a fake ID and was arrested for it. After being taken down to booking, Price admitted to his real identity. Given the nature of his financial crimes, federal authorities stepped in and charged him accordingly. During a search of Price's home, they found equipment for making fake IDs, along with handguns, cell phones, and other evidence to suggest that he was making a living by selling drugs. He spent at least part of his time on the run living in a trailer in a rural part of Florida, where the owners let him stay rent-free in exchange for doing yard work and odd jobs. In 2014, Price pleaded guilty to bank, wire, and securities fraud. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. Given his age of 47 at the time of sentencing, he may end up spending the rest of his life behind bars. Number 1. Francesco Spagnesi. In 2021, a well-respected medical school dropout turned priest was accused of stealing thousands of euros in church donations to fund drug-fueled adult parties at his home in Italy's Tuscany region. 40-year-old Father Francesco Spagnesi confessed to at least some of his illicit deeds, including supplying guests with drugs at his wild bashes. Investigators questioned over 200 people who had attended Spagnesi's parties over a several-year period. During that same time span, Spagnesi allegedly withdrew at least $117,000 from the parish's bank account, even after the church's bishop revoked his access to the account due to his excessive and questionable spending. Spagnesi continued skimming from the collection plate. He also requested cash donations from parishioners who were apparently none the wiser about where the money was actually going. The wayward clergyman spent a large amount of the ill-gotten funds on party favors like which he ordered from online suppliers. Spagnesi and his roommate were also accused of searching for party guests on hookup websites. The most damning allegation came forth when Spagnesi was accused of failing to disclose his HIV-positive status to several of his intimate partners. He allegedly knowingly passed the virus on to at least 2 people. At the conclusion of the investigation in late 2021, Spagnesi was sentenced to 3 years in prison for drug dealing, trafficking, and misappropriation. He was also ordered to repay all the money he stole from the church. Thanks for watching. If you could choose between living eternally or being gifted 20 million and living out your natural lifespan, which option would you choose? Let us know in the comments section below.